Some moments seem insignificant at first, a kind gesture, a passing glance, a stranger in need. But every once in a while, a single act of compassion can set off a chain of events that change lives forever. On a bitter winter night in a small town, a young woman named Ellie offered a shivering Marine a simple blanket. She never imagined that this brief moment of warmth would echo back into her life years later. On the day she wore white, what he gave her then wasn't wrapped in ribbon. It was heavier, deeper, and completely unexpected. Absolutely. The wind howled mercilessly down the narrow street, slicing through Ellie's coat and tugging at the loose strands of her hair. It was one of those nights where the cold seemed to settle deep into your bones, refusing to let go no matter how many layers you wore. The sky was a heavy grey, and snowflakes drifted lazily but steadily, blanketing the sidewalks and rooftops in a fragile white layer. The small town had quieted down long ago, and the only sounds were the crunch of footsteps on snow and the distant hum of a car engine somewhere far away. Ellie's fingers were numb as she pulled the front door of the diner closed behind her, the faint chime of the bell echoing through the empty street. She glanced around, her breath puffing out in short clouds. The shift had been long and slow, and she was eager to get home to the warmth of her little apartment. But as she turned to walk away, something caught her eye. A figure sitting motionless on a bench beneath a flickering street lamp. At first, she hesitated. The bench was old and worn, the paint peeling, and the man sitting there looked like he belonged to a different world altogether. His uniform was unmistakable, the sharp lines of a Marine's fatigues, but worn and creased from what looked like weeks of wear without proper rest. His posture was slouched, his shoulders hunched against the cold, and his hands were tucked deep into his coat pockets. His face was pale, almost ghostly under the dim streetlight, and his dark eyes were fixed somewhere beyond the horizon, glazed with exhaustion and something else. Loneliness. Ellie felt a tug in her chest. She didn't know who he was, why he was here, or what story he carried. But she knew one thing. No one should be out here like this on a night like this, not without warmth, not without hope. For a moment, she just watched him, debating whether she should say something. The street was silent, and the cold was unforgiving. Finally, she turned on her heel and hurried back into the diner. The bell rang sharply as she stepped through the door, and the warmth hit her like a wave, melting the chill from her skin. She rushed to the back room where the spare blankets were kept, leftovers from a few winters ago when the diner had handed out care packages to homeless veterans. Most of them were old and worn, but one thick wool blanket still had enough life left in it to offer some real comfort. Cradling the blanket in her arms, Ellie hurried back outside. The snow had started falling more heavily now, dusting the man's shoulders with white. She stopped a few feet away, her breath catching in her throat. He didn't move. His eyes remained distant. Slowly, gently, she approached and laid the blanket over his trembling shoulders. The fabric was rough but warm, and she could feel the faint shiver that ran through him as it touched his skin. "Here," she said softly, unsure if he could hear her over the wind. "Stay warm." The man blinked, his eyes focusing on her for the first time since she'd noticed him. A flicker of surprise passed across his face, followed by something else. Gratitude, maybe, or disbelief. He nodded once, just once, and for a moment the cold seemed to retreat around them. No words were exchanged, no promises were made, just a silent understanding. Ellie hesitated, wanting to say more but unsure what to say. She felt the weight of the moment settle between them, heavy and fragile all at once. Then, with a small, almost shy smile, she turned and walked away into the night, the blanket's warmth lingering long after she left. That night, Ellie didn't know she had set in motion something much bigger than a simple act of kindness. She didn't know the battles the Marine had fought, the demons he carried, or the quiet desperation that had brought him to that bench. She only knew that sometimes a little warmth is all it takes to light a spark in the coldest of places, and sometimes that spark can change everything. The wind wasn't just cold, it was cruel. It whipped down the empty streets of the town like an invisible predator, clawing at every inch of skin not protected by fabric. Ellie tugged her coat tighter around her, the collar scratching her neck as she hurried along the cracked sidewalk toward home. Snowflakes drifted softly but steadily, sticking to her hair and eyelashes like tiny icy crystals. The air smelled sharp and clean, biting at her lungs with every breath. She had finished her shift hours ago, but had stayed behind to help close the diner. The night was unusually quiet. No cars, no laughter from late-night walkers, just the eerie silence of a town wrapped tight in winter's grip. Her footsteps echoed hollowly beneath the street lamps, their orange glow casting long shadows over the snow-dusted pavement. Just as she passed the old park bench near the corner of Elm and Fifth, something caught her eye, a figure, hunched and still, sitting motionless beneath the weak light. At first, Ellie thought it might be someone waiting for a ride, or just a stranger resting before moving on. But as she slowed, her heart sank. The man was dressed in a marine uniform, though it looked worn and dirty, as if it had weathered more than just a few marches. His face was pale and drawn, shadows under his eyes deeper than tiredness should have made them. His hands, partially visible from inside his jacket pockets, trembled slightly, his body curled inward as if trying to shield itself from the bitter cold. His breath came in short, visible puffs, each one like a fragile whisper disappearing into the night. Ellie stopped dead in her tracks. She didn't know what made her hesitate, the fear, the sudden urge to help, or just the sheer loneliness that radiated from the man's figure. For a moment, all the noise and warmth of the diner faded away, replaced by the raw reality of this stranger sitting alone in the freezing dark. She scanned his face, trying to read it, hoping for some sign that he was okay. But his eyes were unfocused, fixed on nothing and everything all at once. There was no spark of recognition, no flicker of hope, only a heavy, crushing silence. Ellie's mind raced. Should she approach? Would he want her help? Was he dangerous? But before fear could root her in place, another feeling surged up. Compassion, pure and simple. No one deserved to be left out here like this, not on a night that felt like it could freeze the very soul. Her fingers numbed as she dug into her coat pocket, searching for something, anything that might offer warmth. She remembered the extra blanket the diner kept in the back, left over from a winter charity drive. It was thick, woolen and slightly scratchy, but it would be better than nothing. She took a deep breath and turned back toward the diner's side door, heart pounding with every step. The cold air bit at her cheeks, and she had to hurry, fearing the man might leave or disappear into the dark before she returned. Inside the small storage room, the air was stuffy and smelled faintly of old coffee and cleaning supplies. She grabbed the blanket, shaking off the loose dust, and wrapped it around her arms like a shield against the cold. Back outside, the snow was falling heavier now, settling on the bench and the man's shoulders in soft white layers. She took a tentative step forward, her boots crunching in the fresh snow. The man didn't move. His eyes remained distant, glassy with cold and something else. Pain, maybe, or despair. Ellie crouched down gently and draped the blanket over his shoulders. The wool felt rough and unfamiliar against his uniform, but the warmth seeped through like a quiet promise. He shivered, the tremors racking his body almost violently. "Here," she whispered, barely above the sound of the wind. "Stay warm." He blinked slowly, turning his head to look at her. The surprise in his eyes was clear, as if he hadn't expected kindness from a stranger, or from anyone at all. There was no smile, no words, only a slow nod. That small gesture spoke volumes, gratitude, relief, maybe even trust. Ellie felt a lump rise in her throat. She wanted to say more, to ask if he needed a place to stay, or food, or help, but the words caught in her throat, and the cold silence between them stretched like a fragile thread. The wind tugged at her coat again, reminding her how frozen the night was. She gave the man one last look, seeing something in his eyes that she couldn't name, a mixture of weariness and something almost like hope, and then she turned away. Her footsteps echoed louder now as she walked down the street toward home, the blanket's warmth still lingering in her hands. That night, Ellie didn't sleep well. She lay awake, thinking about the Marine, his story, his pain, his loneliness. She imagined the battles he must have fought, the places he'd been, the things he'd seen. The blanket wasn't just a piece of fabric. It was a lifeline, a fragile thread connecting two strangers in a cold, unforgiving world. And though she didn't know it then, that night would become a turning point, not just for him, but for her too. Ellie hadn't expected to see him again, not like this, not here, and certainly not after all the years that had passed since that cold winter night. The Veterans Fundraiser was bustling with quiet energy, a mix of somber respect and hopeful celebration. The hall was decorated modestly, with soft amber lights casting a warm glow over polished wood floors and tables draped in white cloth. People moved in clusters, sharing stories, laughter, and the occasional tear, united by their gratitude and admiration for those who had served. Ellie was there because her fiancé had insisted, He said it was important to support the community, to honor those who had sacrificed so much. She was somewhere between nervous and distracted, scanning the room as she sipped her water, feeling like a visitor in a world she barely understood. The hum of voices blended into a comforting background noise, and the soft music playing over the speakers was almost a balm against the tension she didn't know she carried. Then she saw him. At the podium stood a man in dress blues, polished and proud. His posture was upright, his movements confident yet measured. He spoke with a calm authority that commanded attention, his voice steady as he shared stories of camaraderie, courage, and resilience. Ellie's breath hitched when she recognized the sharp features, the dark hair cut neatly, and the same intense eyes, though now alive with a fierce determination rather than the distant emptiness she remembered. Michael Reyes. The name floated in her mind like a whispered secret. For a moment, Ellie couldn't move. She felt as if the air had thickened around her, the noise of the room fading into a distant murmur. Her heart pounded so loudly she was sure he could hear it. When his gaze swept across the crowd, their eyes locked. Time seemed to slow, the space between them charged with a silent recognition. He nodded slightly, a subtle but unmistakable acknowledgement. After his speech, as the crowd began to disperse and people moved toward refreshments and conversation, Ellie found herself pulled in the direction of the exit. Her fiancé's voice was distant, asking if she was all right, but she hardly heard him. And then, suddenly, he was there. Michael, standing close enough that she could see the faint lines of weariness on his face, the quiet strength that radiated from him. "You probably don't remember me," he said, his voice low but clear, carrying the same calm she had heard at the podium, "but I never forgot you." Ellie swallowed hard, struggling to find words. How could she explain the whirlwind of feelings crashing through her? The surprise, the confusion, the deep well of something she hadn't realized she'd been holding on to all these years. She started, then stopped. There were no easy answers. He smiled, just slightly, and extended his hand. "Michael Reyes." "Ellie," she replied, shaking his hand, feeling the firm grip of someone who had faced far more than she could imagine. They stood there for a moment, two strangers bound by a moment from the past that neither could fully explain. The noise of the fundraiser seemed to fade again, replaced by the steady beating of their own hearts. "I wanted to thank you," Michael said quietly, "for that night. You didn't know it, but you saved me." Ellie's eyes widened. "I'm sorry. You gave me a blanket when I was cold and alone. It was more than just warmth. It was hope, and it kept me going." Tears pricked at the corners of her eyes as she tried to process his words. She had never imagined that a simple act of kindness could mean so much. For the rest of the evening, they talked, carefully, cautiously, sharing pieces of their lives, bridging the gap that time had created. Ellie learned about Michael's deployment, the battles he had fought both abroad and within himself. He spoke of the loneliness, the scars no one could see, and the night when everything seemed too much. And Ellie shared her own story, her dreams, her fears, the life she was building. There was a quiet understanding growing between them, a fragile connection forged in the unlikeliest of ways. When the night came to an end, Michael promised to stay in touch. Ellie felt something shift inside her, something she hadn't expected but welcomed. A sense of closure, perhaps, or the beginning of a new chapter neither of them had anticipated. As she walked out into the cold night air, the snow beginning to fall gently again, Ellie realized that sometimes the past has a way of coming back, not to haunt, but to heal. The weeks that followed Michael's unexpected reappearance in Ellie's life felt like a delicate dance on shifting ice, beautiful and precarious all at once. Their conversations began slowly, at first just brief messages exchanged between busy days, careful to keep the past in its place, yet unwilling to ignore the undeniable thread that connected them. Ellie's fiancé noticed the subtle change in her, how her eyes would sometimes brighten when her phone buzzed, how she'd drift off mid-conversation, lost in thoughts that seemed far away. He tried not to let it bother him, telling himself that Michael was just a reminder of a chapter long closed. But Ellie knew better. The simple blanket she had handed over years ago had grown into something more complicated, and now, as they shared stories and memories, she was discovering layers of Michael she hadn't imagined. One evening, just before sunset, Michael showed up at her door. He didn't call first or send a message, just stood quietly on her doorstep, hands tucked into the pockets of his coat. The fading light cast long shadows on the snow-covered porch, and Ellie's breath hitched as she opened the door. "I wasn't sure if I should come," he admitted, his voice rough but steady. "But I have something for you, something I've been holding on to." Curiosity and a flicker of unease warred inside Ellie. She stepped aside, letting him in, the warmth of her apartment washing over the chill he carried. They sat across from each other in the small living room, the silence thick and heavy, until Michael pulled a worn box from his coat. "It's a collection," he explained, voice low. "Letters I wrote to you, but never sent." Ellie's fingers trembled as she reached for the box, the weight of it heavier than the paper inside. She opened it carefully and found bundles of neatly folded letters, some stained with time, others crisp but faded. Each one was a glimpse into Michael's mind and heart, his battles overseas, the nights filled with fear, the struggle to find light in darkness, and the haunting memories that refused to fade. As Ellie read through the pages, tears blurred the words. She saw the man behind the uniform, vulnerable and raw. He wrote about the moment she gave him that blanket, the smallest act of kindness that had become a lifeline when everything else seemed lost. His words spoke of despair, hope, and an unspoken gratitude that had never found a way to reach her until now. The weight of his truth settled over her like a storm. She hadn't just warmed his body that night, she had ignited a spark that kept him moving forward, even when the road was impossible. And now, here he was, standing before her, no longer a stranger, but someone she couldn't easily forget. Ellie's fiancé's calls went unanswered that evening. She sat with Michael's letters, the silence around her both comforting and unbearable. The past was no longer distant. It had returned with a force that made everything uncertain. Michael looked at her then, his eyes searching. "I'm not here to disrupt your life," he said quietly. "I just needed you to know the truth. I needed you to understand why that night meant more than you could ever realize." Ellie nodded, feeling the fragile walls she'd built begin to crack. The truth was complicated. So were the feelings that came with it. That night marked a turning point. Ellie knew the road ahead would be tangled with difficult choices and emotions she hadn't expected to face. But she also understood something deeper, that some connections, no matter how painful or unexpected, are meant to teach us about grace, forgiveness, and the power of simply being there for one another. The morning light filtered softly through the curtains, painting Ellie's room with a gentle golden hue. For the first time in weeks, the weight that had pressed on her chest felt lighter, as if the dawn itself had whispered promises of something new. She lay still, her thoughts drifting to Michael, his words, his presence, the quiet strength that had come to mean so much more than she ever imagined. Today wasn't just any day, it was the day she was supposed to marry, the day she had dreamed about since she was a child, surrounded by white flowers, family, friends, and the hopeful promise of a lifetime together. But as the minutes ticked closer to the moment she would walk down the aisle, Ellie felt a tempest raging inside her. A storm of uncertainty, hope, fear, and longing all tangled into one. She rose slowly, the cold floor beneath her feet grounding her in the reality she faced. Her fiancé was waiting downstairs, dressed in his finest suit, calm and patient. He didn't know about Michael, the letters, the nights spent talking, the emotions that had broken through years of silence and regret. Ellie hadn't yet found the words to tell him, and part of her wondered if she ever would. As she prepared for the ceremony, the house buzzed with the quiet chaos of final arrangements, the florist's gentle voice, the rustle of fabric, the distant laughter of family members sharing stories. Ellie moved through it all with a strange detachment, her mind caught between the life she'd planned and the one she now had to choose. The first step down the aisle felt like walking through a dream, the eyes of loved ones fixed on her, the soft music swelling around her. But all Ellie could see was the door at the end, the path stretching toward a future she wasn't sure she was ready to face. And then, in the crowd, she saw him. Michael stood at the back of the chapel, his expression unreadable but unmistakable. Time slowed again, the air thick with unspoken words. Their eyes met, and in that instant Ellie's world shifted. The vows began, words of love and commitment spoken aloud, but Ellie's heart was elsewhere. Each promise felt heavy, weighed down by the truth she held inside, a truth that refused to be silenced. When the moment came for the ring, Ellie hesitated. The polished band felt cold in her hand, a symbol of a future she wasn't sure she wanted. The room seemed to blur around her as tears welled up, blurring her vision. She took a shaky breath and turned toward the back of the chapel. "Wait!" she said, voice trembling but steady enough to command attention. Whispers rippled through the crowd as Ellie moved down the aisle, past rows of surprised faces, toward Michael. The space between them closed, charged with years of pain and hope and the fragile possibility of healing. Michael reached out gently, taking her hands in his. "Ellie," he said softly, "you don't have to choose today. Not if you're not ready." The room held its breath as she looked at him, really looked, seeing the man who had been a stranger once, who had become a lifeline, a reminder of courage, and now, maybe something more. Ellie smiled through her tears, a smile full of gratitude and new beginnings. "I don't know what the future holds," she whispered, "but I know I need to be true to myself." The ceremony ended without the traditional vows or rings, but it wasn't a failure. It was a beginning, a moment of honesty and bravery that changed everything. Outside, the snow began to fall again, soft and silent. Ellie and Michael stepped into the winter night together, wrapped not just in blankets, but in the warmth of something that had taken years to find: hope, connection, and the courage to face whatever came next. Ellie stood alone as the winter wind wrapped around her, carrying memories that burned like ice. Michael was gone, vanished into the cold night, leaving behind only silence. The blanket she once gave him now felt heavy in her hands, a fragile thread to a past that could never be reclaimed. Tears blurred her vision as she whispered his name to the empty air, knowing some moments are forever lost, some hearts forever broken, and some goodbyes never truly said.